I'm Major Smith, 28, and I rose through the ranks on discipline, quiet competence, and service. For years, I covered my father's emergencies, showed up when no one else did, and kept the peace. But when he stood at his own wedding and called me a mistake, then held up his new daughter as his real child, I drew a line that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed by someone you carried for years? Drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Tell me where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. I learned early that my father's love came with conditions I could never quite meet. Growing up, he was a man of extremes, one day lifting me onto his shoulders at the park, calling me his little soldier, the next dismissing my school achievements with a distracted nod while he scrolled through his phone. I became an expert at reading his moods, adjusting my expectations accordingly. The inconsistency shaped me in ways I'm still understanding. When he was present, really present, it felt like basking in sunlight. He'd tell stories about his own childhood, laugh at my jokes, ask about my friends. But those moments were rare, scattered between long stretches of him being physically there but emotionally absent. I'd find myself performing for his attention, bringing home perfect report cards, learning his favorite songs on piano, memorizing statistics about baseball teams he liked. By high school, I'd established a pattern that would follow me into adulthood. I became the daughter who called first, who remembered birthdays, who showed up to every family gathering whether I was welcomed warmly or treated like an obligation. When he lost his job during my senior year, I worked extra shifts at the grocery store to help with his mortgage payment. When his car broke down, I coordinated repairs and covered the cost. When he seemed lonely after my mother moved out, I visited twice a week with takeout from his favorite Chinese restaurant. The imbalance never felt sustainable, but I told myself it was temporary. That eventually, my consistency would earn me the kind of steady affection I watched him give to his hobbies, his friends, even the neighbor's dog. I was investing in something I believed would eventually pay dividends, a relationship where I wouldn't have to prove my worth every single day. After college, I joined the military. The decision surprised him. "You sure about this?" he asked, as if I'd announced plans to join the circus. But the structure suited me. The clear expectations, the merit-based advancement, the knowledge that respect was earned through competence and reliability, it was everything my relationship with him wasn't. My commanding officers valued my strategic thinking and calm under pressure. My colleagues started calling me General half-jokingly, then with genuine respect as I advanced through the ranks. In the military, I discovered what it felt like to belong somewhere based on what I contributed rather than who I was related to. My opinions mattered in briefings. My leadership was sought during difficult operations. When I received commendations, they were based on measurable achievements, not someone's fluctuating mood or current priorities. Still, I maintained the careful dance with my father. I called him from deployment. I sent money when he mentioned struggling with bills. I took leave to attend his birthday dinner, where he introduced me to his friends as my daughter, the one in the army, as if my military career was a minor hobby rather than a decade of dedicated service. The irony wasn't lost on me. At work, I commanded respect from people who had never met my family. Soldiers twice my age deferred to my judgment. Pentagon officials sought my analysis on complex strategic questions. Yet every interaction with my father left me feeling like I was still that little girl performing for scraps of approval. Looking back, I think I stayed in that dynamic because the alternative felt like giving up on something I'd invested too much to abandon. Every birthday call, every emergency loan, every time I bit my tongue when he forgot an important detail about my life, it all felt like building towards some eventual recognition. Some moment when he'd acknowledge what I'd always been trying to prove. The pattern intensified after I made captain. My increased salary meant I could help more substantially with his financial emergencies, which seemed to occur with suspicious regularity. A surprise medical bill. Property taxes higher than expected. Car trouble. Each request came with reminders of family obligation, how much he'd sacrificed raising me, how children should support their aging parents. I never said no, but I started keeping track. Not out of resentment, exactly, but because the numbers helped me understand something I couldn't quite articulate yet. In 3 years, I'd sent him nearly $30,000. I'd taken emergency leave twice to help him move apartments. I'd co-signed for his credit card when his own credit failed him. Meanwhile, our conversations remained surface level. He rarely asked about my work beyond generic questions about, "How's the army treating you?" He never remembered my friends' names or followed up on situations I'd mentioned. When I was promoted to major, he responded to my text with congrats and immediately launched into a story about his own work troubles. The disconnect between how I was valued professionally and personally created a strange double life. Monday through Friday, I was Major Smith, strategic planner, team leader, someone whose counsel was valued and whose presence commanded rooms. Weekends and holidays, I became the trying too hard daughter, grateful for basic acknowledgement, walking on eggshells to maintain fragile peace. Friends noticed the transformation when my father called during group dinners. I'd step outside to take his calls, returning with a forced smile and an excuse about family obligations. My closest friend, Melissa, a fellow officer who'd known me since basic training, finally confronted me about it. "You're different around him," she said after watching me handle one of his crisis calls during a rare weekend off. "You shrink." She was right, but I wasn't ready to examine why. Instead, I doubled down on being the perfect daughter, the one who never demanded too much, who always came through in emergencies, who accepted whatever level of relationship he was willing to offer. I told myself this was maturity, that adult relationships required compromise and patience. The truth I wasn't ready to face was simpler. I was terrified that if I stopped performing, stopped giving, stopped showing up, I'd discover I'd been right all along about my worth in his eyes. The shift began subtly, the way most betrayals do. My father met Linda at a community center volunteer event. She was organizing a charity drive. He was there fulfilling court-ordered community service for unpaid parking tickets I'd eventually help him resolve. Within months, she became a constant presence in his conversations. "Linda thinks I should eat more vegetables," he'd say during our weekly calls. "Linda found this great deal on car insurance. Linda says I'm too generous with money." That last comment stung because I knew he meant the money I'd been providing for his emergencies. Linda had 2 children from her previous marriage, Jessica, 16, and Michael, 12. My father spoke about them with an enthusiasm I recognized, but had rarely experienced directed at me. Jessica was brilliant at math, just like her mother. Michael was a natural athlete, gonna be a star. He attended Jessica's Honor Society induction and Michael's soccer games, events he documented extensively on the Facebook account Linda had helped him create. I started noticing changes during family gatherings. My father would arrive with stories about the kids, Jessica's acceptance to advanced placement courses, Michael's winning goal in some tournament. When relatives asked about me, he'd offer brief updates. "She's still in the army. Doing well, I guess." Then he'd pivot back to Jessica's science fair project or Michael's batting average. The rewriting of history was more subtle. During my aunt's birthday dinner, he referred to Linda's family as our chance to do things right this time. When his old friend mentioned remembering me as a child, my father smiled tightly and said, "Different era, different priorities." As if my childhood had been some unfortunate first draft he was now revising. Financial requests became more frequent and less apologetic. He needed money for Jessica's tutoring, Michael's equipment, Linda's car repairs. When I hesitated before agreeing to cover Jessica's SAT prep course, he reminded me that family takes care of family, apparently missing the irony that Jessica wasn't technically family yet. The most painful changes were the smallest ones. He stopped remembering details about my military service, confusing my deployment locations, forgetting my promotion dates, introducing me to Linda's friends as my daughter in the service, as if the specific branch or my rank were irrelevant details. Meanwhile, he could recite Jessica's GPA to the 3rd decimal place and knew the exact statistics from Michael's last 3 games. Linda's influence became increasingly obvious. She had strong opinions about moving forward and focusing on the future. During one particularly uncomfortable dinner at their shared apartment, she explained her philosophy: Some people get stuck dwelling on old relationships and past mistakes. We believe in creating new traditions, building something fresh. The apartment itself reflected this philosophy. Photos of Jessica and Michael lined the mantel. Their artwork covered the refrigerator. School calendars and sports schedules dominated the kitchen bulletin board. My military commendations, which had previously held prominent placement in his living room, were nowhere to be seen. When I asked about them, he said they were somewhere safe and changed the subject to Michael's upcoming baseball season. Linda nodded approvingly, as if acknowledging my achievements would somehow contaminate their fresh start. Extended family began treating me differently too. At my cousin's wedding, my uncle asked if I'd heard about my father's new family. The phrasing stung, as if Linda's children had replaced rather than joined whatever family structure had existed before. When I clarified that I was still his daughter, my uncle looked embarrassed and quickly changed the subject. The pattern intensified when they announced their engagement. My father called to share the news, but spent more time discussing Linda's children's excitement than acknowledging the significant step he was taking. Jessica wants to help plan the wedding, he said. She's got great taste, just like her mother. And Michael's already asking if he can wear a tux instead of a regular suit. When I congratulated him and asked about wedding details, he was vague. Small ceremony, just close family and friends. Linda's handling most of the arrangements. I assumed I'd receive an official invitation, but weeks passed without one. When I finally asked directly, he seemed surprised I'd expected formal communication. Of course you're invited, he said, as if I'd asked an absurd question. It's next month at Linda's church. I'll text you the details. The text arrived 2 days before the wedding, location, time, and a note that said, casual dress, no gifts necessary. No mention of my role in the ceremony, no request for help with arrangements, no acknowledgement that this event would fundamentally change our family structure. I should have recognized the warning signs, but I was still operating under old assumptions about family loyalty and unconditional connection. I bought a modest dress, arranged leave from my current assignment, and showed up expecting to witness my father's happiness while maintaining my usual position on the periphery of his attention. Instead, I walked into a carefully orchestrated humiliation that would finally teach me exactly where I stood in his hierarchy of priorities. The church was smaller than I'd expected, filled with Linda's extended family and their mutual friends from the volunteer organization. Jessica and Michael sat in the front row, dressed formally and beaming. I took a seat in the back, recognizing almost no one. The ceremony itself was standard, but during the reception, my father stood to address the gathered crowd. That's when everything changed forever. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with Linda's careful attention to detail. White and gold streamers, professional photographs of the happy couple, tables arranged to encourage mingling. I sat with distant relatives I barely knew, making polite conversation about my military career while watching Jessica and Michael hold court at the head table. Linda looked radiant in her ivory dress, and my father seemed genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. During dinner, he was animated, telling stories, laughing loudly at Linda's jokes, posing for photographs with her children. I found myself studying him, trying to remember the last time I'd seen him this engaged and present. The speeches began after dessert. Linda's sister spoke about their childhood bond. Her ex-husband, maintaining cordial relations for the children's sake, offered kind words about my father's dedication to Jessica and Michael. Several friends shared anecdotes about the couple's courtship and their excitement about the future. Then my father stood, champagne glass in hand, smiling broadly at the assembled crowd. He thanked everyone for attending, praised Linda's children for welcoming him into their lives, and spoke eloquently about second chances and new beginnings. The room was warm and attentive, genuinely happy for the couple. Then his tone shifted slightly. He became more serious, his voice taking on the weight of important announcements. Before we continue celebrating, he said, I want to address something that's been on my mind. The room quieted expectantly. I assumed he was about to acknowledge the complexity of blended families or perhaps mention his gratitude for Linda's patience during their courtship. Instead, he turned in my direction, and I felt a chill of recognition, the same expression he'd worn during childhood confrontations when he was about to deliver judgment. "Some of you might be wondering about my past," he continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "About decisions I made before I met Linda and gained the wisdom to understand what real family means." My stomach clenched. Around me, guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing tension they couldn't identify. Linda watched from the head table, her expression unreadable. "I want to be clear about something," my father said, his eyes meeting mine directly for the first time all evening. "My daughter sitting back there, she's not really my daughter in any way that matters. She was a mistake from a relationship I've spent years trying to correct." The silence that followed was absolute. Guests turned to stare at me, their expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to morbid curiosity. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but forced myself to remain still, drawing on military training to maintain composure under hostile conditions. "Linda has given me real children now," he continued, gesturing toward Jessica and Michael. "Children who understand respect and gratitude and what it means to be part of a loving family. Jessica and Michael are my real legacy." He raised his glass toward the head table, apparently intending to conclude with a toast, but Jessica had gone rigid in her chair. She was staring at me with an expression I couldn't initially interpret, recognition mixed with something approaching awe. "Jessica, Michael, please stand so everyone can meet my perfect children," my father said, oblivious to Jessica's frozen state. Michael stood obediently, but Jessica remained seated, her eyes locked on mine across the room. The silence stretched uncomfortably as guests waited for her to comply with her new stepfather's request. Finally, she rose slowly, but instead of smiling and accepting the recognition, she whispered something that carried clearly in the hushed room. "She's my general." My father's champagne glass paused halfway to his lips. "What did you say?" Jessica's voice was stronger now, filled with an emotion I recognized as the respect I'd grown accustomed to receiving from fellow service members. "She's my general. Major Smith. I wrote my honors history report about her unit's work in Afghanistan. Her strategic planning saved hundreds of lives during the evacuation operations." The room's energy shifted palpably. Guests who had been looking at me with pity or curiosity now reassessed what they were witnessing. My father's face went through several expressions: confusion, irritation, and finally something approaching panic as he realized his carefully orchestrated narrative was unraveling. "Jessica, sit down," Linda hissed from beside her daughter, but Jessica ignored her mother's command. "She's decorated for valor," Jessica continued, addressing the room now rather than just my father. "She's one of the youngest majors in her division. I've been following her career for months, hoping someday I might be half as accomplished." The words hit me like a physical blow, but not from pain, from recognition of something I'd never expected to experience in this context. Here was someone who knew my actual achievements, who valued them not because they were related to me, but because they were genuinely impressive. My father set down his champagne glass with shaking hands. His perfect moment had become something else entirely, a public revelation of his ignorance about the woman he'd just dismissed as a mistake. The room remained frozen, wedding guests uncertain how to respond to this unexpected turn. Linda was whispering urgently to Jessica, trying to restore the celebration's previous momentum. Michael looked confused and slightly frightened by the tension. But I was watching my father, seeing him recalculate rapidly as he realized that his throwaway dismissal had been delivered to a room that now understood exactly whom he'd been disparaging. His new family's respect had been built partly on admiration for achievements he'd never bothered to learn about. The moment crystallized something I'd been avoiding for years: the futility of seeking recognition from someone determined to remain ignorant of who I actually was. I stood quietly, maintaining the dignity that had been trained into me through years of representing my country in complex situations. I met Jessica's eyes across the room and nodded once in acknowledgement, then turned and walked toward the exit with measured steps. Behind me, I heard Linda attempting damage control, my father's voice rising in defensive explanation, and the awkward resumption of conversation as guests tried to salvage the celebration. But I was done performing for audiences that had already decided not to see me clearly. I drove for 2 hours before pulling into a rest stop to process what had just happened. The highway was nearly empty at 11 p.m., giving me space to think without the immediate pressure of response or reaction. In the military, we're trained to compartmentalize during crisis situations, to function first and feel later. That training served me now. The words replayed in my mind with brutal clarity. She's not really my daughter in any way that matters. She was a mistake from a relationship I've spent years trying to correct. 27 words that summarized decades of careful investment, patient loyalty, and willful blindness to mounting evidence. What disturbed me most wasn't the cruelty. I'd experienced his dismissive treatment before, though never so publicly or absolutely. What unsettled me was the relief I felt underneath the humiliation. Finally, the pretense was over. No more wondering if I was misreading situations or being overly sensitive. No more calibrating my expectations against his inconsistent behavior. He'd drawn the line clearly and publicly. I called Melissa from the parking lot. She was stationed in Virginia now, but kept late hours reviewing intelligence reports. She answered on the second ring. "How was the wedding?" she asked, then immediately caught my tone. What happened? I gave her the facts without editorial commentary, the way I'd brief a superior officer on a mission that hadn't gone according to plan. She listened without interruption until I finished. "Jesus Christ," she said finally. "Are you okay?" "I think so. I think I'm more okay than I should be." That's shock. And probably relief. You've been carrying this relationship like a 100-pound pack for years. Someone just cut the straps. Melissa understood military metaphors, but more importantly, she'd observed my family dynamics during the years we'd served together. She'd watched me take calls during field exercises, coordinate financial help during our brief leaves, maintain diplomatic relations with someone who gave minimal effort in return. "The stepdaughter knew who you were," she said. "That's something." That's the strangest part. This 16-year-old has done more research on my career than my own father ever did. She knew details about operations he's never asked about. Because she was genuinely interested. She wasn't looking for reasons to diminish what you've accomplished. We talked for another hour while I sat in my rental car watching occasional trucks pass on the interstate. Melissa helped me articulate something I'd been sensing but couldn't name. The relationship had been unsustainable not because I wasn't trying hard enough, but because it required me to accept a fundamentally diminished version of myself. The drive home gave me more time to think. I reviewed the years of emergency loans, crisis management, careful attention to his needs and preferences. Not because the investment had been wasted, but because I needed to understand what I'd actually been purchasing with all that effort. I'd bought the illusion of family connection. The privilege of remaining in orbit around someone whose attention I craved but could never quite capture. The hope that consistency might eventually earn me the kind of unconditional acceptance I'd watched him offer to hobbies, friends, and eventually Linda's children. But I'd never bought genuine relationship because that required mutual investment from someone who had categorized me as a mistake from the beginning. By the time I reached my apartment on base, I'd made several decisions. First, no more financial support. The emergency loans, bill payments, and casual gifts had been transactions in a market that didn't actually exist. He'd been taking payment for goods he never intended to deliver. Second, no more emotional availability on demand. The twice-weekly calls, the visits during leave, the careful attention to his problems and priorities, all of it had been my attempt to prove worthiness to someone who'd predetermined my value. Third, no more performing at family events for audiences that had already decided not to see me clearly. The graduations, birthday dinners, holiday gatherings where I managed his moods and tried to maintain peace, those days were finished. The decisions felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. I was cutting ties to the only family relationship I'd ever known, even if that relationship had been largely one-sided. But I was also choosing to stop investing energy in something that would never yield the returns I'd been hoping for. Monday morning, I returned to work with unusual focus. My current assignment involved strategic planning for training operations, work that required clear thinking about resource allocation and realistic assessment of potential outcomes. The parallels to my personal life weren't lost on me. My commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, noticed the change. "Good weekend?" he asked during our Tuesday briefing. "Clarifying weekend," I said, and left it at that. Over the following days, I discovered what my life felt like without the constant low-level anxiety of managing my father's approval. I slept better. I was more present during conversations with colleagues. I found myself making social plans for weekends instead of keeping schedules flexible in case he needed something. The first test came Thursday when he called. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message. Confusion about why I'd left the wedding early, concern that I might be upset about something, and a request to call him back to discuss whatever misunderstanding had occurred. I didn't call back that day or the next. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't immediately available to manage his emotional needs or provide reassurance about his behavior. The second call came Saturday with a different tone. Disappointment that I wasn't responding. Reminders about family loyalty and obligation. A subtle suggestion that my reaction was disproportionate to whatever had upset me at the wedding. Still I waited. Not out of revenge or manipulation, but because I needed time to determine what, if anything, I wanted to say. The third call arrived Sunday evening, and this time I answered. "Finally," he said. "I was starting to worry something had happened to you." "I've been thinking," I said, cutting straight to the purpose of the conversation. Military training had taught me the efficiency of direct communication, and I saw no reason to waste time on pleasantries. Good. I was hoping we could clear up whatever happened at the wedding. Linda thinks maybe you misunderstood something I said during my speech." The immediate deflection wasn't surprising, but his assumption that I'd misunderstood rather than heard him clearly revealed everything I needed to know about how he'd processed the evening. "I understood perfectly," I said. "You called me a mistake and said I wasn't your daughter in any way that matters. You introduced Linda's children as your real legacy. I don't think there's much room for misinterpretation there." Silence stretched across the phone line. In the background, I could hear a television playing, some sports broadcast he'd been watching when I called. "Look, I might have phrased things awkwardly," he said finally. "It was an emotional day, and I was trying to make Linda's kids feel welcome. You know how complicated blended families can be." "I know exactly how complicated they can be. What I'm learning is how simple they become when one parent decides some children matter and others don't. That's not fair. I've always treated you well." The statement was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. Instead, I found myself drawing on the same calm I used during difficult briefings with volatile personnel. "You've treated me like a convenience," I said. "Someone who shows up when you need money or emotional support, then disappears when you want to focus on what really matters to you. That worked when I was willing to accept scraps of attention, but I'm not anymore. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this attitude needs to stop. Family doesn't abandon family over hurt feelings." "You're absolutely right," I said. "Family doesn't abandon family. So I'm confused about why you've spent the last 2 years systematically erasing me from your life, culminating in public announcement that I was a mistake you've been trying to correct." Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice carried the edge of irritation I'd learned to navigate carefully throughout childhood. "I think you're being dramatic. And ungrateful. Do you have any idea how many fathers wouldn't have maintained a relationship after divorce? How many wouldn't have stayed involved? Staying involved usually means knowing basic information about your child's life. When's the last time you asked about my work? My friends? My interests outside of how they might benefit you? I ask about your job all the time. You ask, how's the army treating you? Like it's a hobby I picked up in college. You've never asked about my responsibilities, my achievements, or my career goals. Meanwhile, you can recite Jessica's GPA and Michael's batting average from memory. That's different. They live with us. They're part of our daily lives. They're part of your daily life because you chose to make them priorities. You chose to attend their events, learn about their interests, invest in their futures. You've had the same opportunities with me for 28 years. I could hear him shifting in his chair, the television volume decreasing as he focused on the conversation. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. The question hung in the air like a challenge. What did I want? For years, I'd wanted recognition, appreciation, the kind of steady affection I watched him offer to others. I'd wanted him to be proud of my accomplishments, interested in my thoughts, willing to invest the same energy in our relationship that I'd been providing unilaterally. But sitting in my apartment, looking at the military commendations on my wall and thinking about the respect I commanded in professional settings, I realized I didn't want those things from him anymore. Not because I'd stopped caring, but because I'd finally understood they weren't actually available. Nothing, I said, and meant it completely. I don't want anything from you anymore. Don't be ridiculous. Of course you want something. Everyone wants something. I wanted a father who was interested in who I actually am rather than disappointed that I'm not someone else. I wanted mutual respect and genuine connection. I wanted to matter to you the way Linda's children matter. But I've figured out that wanting those things from you is like expecting water from a stone. So what are you saying? You're cutting me off? Over something I said at my own wedding. I'm saying I'm done pretending this is a relationship when it's actually been a one-person performance. I'm done providing financial and emotional support to someone who considers me a mistake he's trying to correct. And I'm done showing up to family events where my presence is tolerated rather than welcomed. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the essential points had been established. He alternated between defensive explanations, attempts at manipulation, and genuine confusion that I was changing the terms of engagement. Linda's voice appeared in the background at one point, offering strategic suggestions I couldn't quite hear. When I finally ended the call, I felt the same clarity I experienced after completing difficult mission briefings. The objective had been accomplished: clear communication of new boundaries and realistic assessment of what relationship, if any, remained possible. Over the following weeks, he tried various approaches to restore the previous dynamic. Angry voicemails about family loyalty, guilt-laden messages about aging parents and obligations to support elderly relatives, financial emergencies that had previously prompted immediate assistance. I responded to none of them. Not out of cruelty, but because engaging would signal willingness to resume patterns that had never served anyone's genuine interests. The consequences of his wedding speech began manifesting in ways he hadn't anticipated. Extended family members who'd witnessed his public dismissal started treating him with subtle disapproval. His new in-laws, who'd heard Jessica's recognition of my achievements, asked uncomfortable questions about his relationship with his accomplished daughter. But those consequences were his to manage. I was learning to invest my energy in relationships that operated on principles of mutual respect and genuine interest, the kind of connections I discovered were possible outside the family that had never quite figured out how to value what I offered. 6 weeks after the wedding, I received an unexpected email from Jessica. The subject line read, "Thank you for your service," and I initially assumed it was a school assignment about military personnel. Instead, it was a carefully crafted message that revealed she'd been researching my career far more extensively than I'd realized. She knew details about the Afghanistan evacuation operations that had earned me a Bronze Star. She'd read articles about my unit's innovative approach to strategic planning under crisis conditions. She'd even found interviews I'd given for military publications about leadership in high-stress situations. "I hope it's okay that I'm contacting you directly," she wrote. "I wanted to apologize for what happened at the wedding. I also wanted you to know that your work has influenced my decision to apply for West Point. I've been studying military strategy because of articles I read about your operations." The email was sophisticated, respectful, and demonstrated genuine understanding of concepts that my own father had never bothered to learn. A 16-year-old had taken more interest in my professional achievements than the man who'd raised me. I responded carefully, acknowledging her apology while focusing on her academic interests. We began exchanging emails about military history, strategic theory, and her preparation for academy applications. She was brilliant, analytical, curious, and driven in ways that reminded me of my younger self. The correspondence revealed details about her home situation that explained her wedding reaction. Linda had been pressuring my father to completely sever ties with his past, framing continued connection with me as disloyalty to their new family unit. Jessica had witnessed arguments about financial support I'd provided, with Linda characterizing my help as manipulation rather than genuine assistance. "She doesn't understand that you were actually helping," Jessica wrote in one email. She thinks you were trying to control him by making him dependent on your money. But I've seen the bills you paid and the problems you solved. You were just being a good daughter to someone who didn't appreciate it." Her perspective offered validation I hadn't expected to receive from anyone in that family system. More importantly, it helped me understand that my father's treatment of me hadn't occurred in a vacuum. It had been encouraged and reinforced by someone who saw my presence as an obstacle to her vision of their future. Meanwhile, the consequences of cutting off financial support began manifesting in his daily life. Without my emergency assistance, he struggled with unexpected expenses that had previously been my responsibility to resolve. His credit card debt accumulated without my periodic payments to bring balances down to manageable levels. I learned about his difficulties not from him. He'd stopped calling after our confrontational conversation, but from worried relatives who assumed I knew about his problems. My aunt called to ask if I'd heard about his car repossession. A cousin mentioned seeing him at the food bank. Each time, I felt a familiar pull toward intervention. Years of conditioning made me want to solve his problems, restore stability, resume my role as the daughter who fixed whatever went wrong. But I forced myself to remember the wedding speech and his explicit rejection of our relationship. "You can't save someone from the consequences of their own choices," Melissa reminded me during one of our calls. "Especially someone who's made it clear they don't value what you've been providing." The truth was harsh but necessary. His financial struggles were the natural result of living beyond his means while relying on my subsidies to cover the difference. Without that safety net, he was facing realistic assessment of his actual resources versus his desired lifestyle. My professional life, meanwhile, flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without the constant drain of managing his emotional needs and financial crises, I had energy to invest in career development and meaningful relationships with colleagues. I was selected for advanced strategic training that would position me for promotion to lieutenant colonel. The achievement felt different from previous military successes because I wasn't measuring it against someone else's approval or trying to prove worthiness to an audience determined not to recognize my value. It was simply professional recognition earned through competent performance, the kind of straightforward transaction I'd grown accustomed to in military settings. 3 months after the wedding, Linda called me directly. The conversation was awkward from the beginning. She'd never spoken to me without my father present, and her tone carried subtle hostility disguised as concern. "I'm worried about your dad," she said. "He's been really depressed since you two had your falling out. I think he misses you more than he wants to admit." "I'm sorry you're struggling," I said, meaning it genuinely. But our relationship ended when he announced that I was a mistake he'd been trying to correct. I can't maintain connection with someone who fundamentally doesn't want me in his life. He was just nervous about the wedding. He didn't mean those things the way they sounded. He meant them exactly the way they sounded. And honestly, I think they were probably the most honest things he's ever said to me. Linda's frustration became more apparent as she realized I wasn't responding to guilt-based manipulation. She tried several approaches, appeals to family duty, suggestions that I was being cruel to an aging parent, implications that my military training had made me unnaturally hard-hearted. Finally, she revealed her actual concern. "He's been talking about contacting you directly to ask for help with some bills. I think that would be a mistake for both of you." "I agree completely," I said. "It would be a mistake because I wouldn't provide the help, and that would just create more disappointment for everyone involved." The conversation ended with mutual understanding that no reconciliation was forthcoming. Linda had wanted to preserve their financial stability without acknowledging the fundamental changes in our relationship. I had wanted to maintain boundaries without cruel punishment of someone who was struggling. Neither of us got exactly what we'd hoped for, but we'd established realistic expectations about the future. That evening, I realized I'd been holding my breath for months, waiting for some kind of resolution or closure that was never going to arrive. The wedding speech hadn't been an emotional outburst I could forgive and forget. It had been a clear statement of his actual feelings, probably the most authentic thing he'd ever shared with me. Accepting that truth meant accepting that the relationship I'd been trying to build had never actually existed from his perspective. I'd been performing in a one-person show, hoping eventually to earn genuine connection from someone who'd categorized me as a mistake from the beginning. The acceptance brought peace I hadn't expected. For months after cutting ties, I encountered my father unexpectedly at the grocery store near his apartment. I was visiting the area for a work conference and had stopped to buy coffee before driving back to base. He was in the produce section, looking older and more tired than I'd remembered. For a moment, we stared at each other across a display of apples, both uncertain how to navigate this unplanned interaction. He looked like he wanted to approach, then seemed to reconsider. I felt no immediate urge to initiate conversation, but also no hostility, just the neutral acknowledgement you might give a former acquaintance. Finally, he walked over, his movements careful and deliberate. "Hello," he said simply. "Hello," I replied, maintaining the same neutral tone. "You look well. The military's treating you good." There it was, the same generic question he'd been asking for years, delivered now with obvious discomfort. "I'm doing fine. Thank you for asking." We stood in awkward silence for several seconds. Other shoppers navigated around us, focused on their own purchases and unaware they were witnessing the careful choreography of a relationship that had officially ended. "I heard you made Lieutenant Colonel," he said eventually. The news surprised me. I had been promoted 6 weeks earlier, but I hadn't told anyone in his circle. "Yes. Where did you hear that?" "Jessica mentioned it. She keeps track of military announcements online." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Congratulations. That's a big achievement." "Thank you." Another silence stretched between us. I could see him struggling with whether to say more, whether to attempt some kind of bridge-building conversation or simply accept the boundaries I'd established. "Listen," he said finally, "I know things got complicated after the wedding. Maybe we could get coffee sometime and talk." "I don't think that would be productive," I said, not unkindly but with finality. "I think we've both said what needed to be said." He nodded slowly, disappointment flickering across his face, but not surprise. "Well, take care of yourself." "You too." I watched him walk away, pushing his cart toward the checkout lanes. He moved with less confidence than I remembered, as if the months since our confrontation had aged him in ways that went beyond simple time passage. The encounter left me feeling neither vindicated nor regretful. It simply confirmed that we'd both accepted the new reality. Whatever relationship we'd had was finished, and neither of us was interested in pretending otherwise. That evening, I called Jessica to thank her for tracking my promotion. Our email correspondence had continued steadily, evolving into something resembling mentorship as she prepared for her West Point application. "I hope it was okay that I told him," she said when I mentioned the grocery store meeting. He seemed really proud when I showed him the announcement, but also kind of sad. "It's fine. Public information should be public." "How are things at home?" "Tense. Mom's been pushing him to completely stop talking about you, but he brings you up sometimes when she's not around. I think he's starting to understand what he lost." I doubted he truly understood, but I appreciated Jessica's optimistic interpretation. More importantly, I was grateful for her continued respect and interest in my career, which provided connection to that family without requiring reconciliation with my father. "Have you heard anything about your West Point application?" "Not yet, but my interviews went well. I told them about studying your strategic planning methods and how military leadership appeals to me. I think it helped that I could discuss specific examples rather than just general interest." Her preparation impressed me constantly. She'd researched not just military history but contemporary strategic theory, current operational challenges, and leadership principles I'd taken years to fully understand. She approached the academy application with the same systematic thoroughness I used for major military operations. 6 weeks later, she called with acceptance news. "I got in," she said, her voice mixing excitement with nervous energy. "I start basic training in June." "That's outstanding." "You've earned it completely." "I wanted to ask you something," she said after we'd discussed her preparation timeline. "Would you be willing to write me a reference letter for advanced placement in strategic studies?" "I know it's asking a lot since we're not technically related." "We're not technically related, but you've been more interested in my career than most people who share my DNA." I'd be honored to write the letter. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. My father's stepdaughter was benefiting from the military expertise he'd never bothered to learn about or value. She was building her future partly on admiration for achievements he dismissed as irrelevant to his own priorities. Writing her recommendation letter became an unexpectedly meaningful exercise. For the first time, someone was asking me to formally document my professional accomplishments not for my own advancement, but to help someone else succeed. Jessica's questions about leadership challenges and strategic thinking forced me to articulate aspects of my career I'd rarely examined consciously. "You've been a role model for me since I learned about your work," she wrote in a thank you email after I submitted the letter. "I hope someday I can have the kind of impact you've had on military operations and strategic planning." Her words carried weight that my father's approval never could have, because they were based on genuine understanding of what I'd actually accomplished rather than familial obligation or performative pride. Meanwhile, reports about my father's situation continued filtering through extended family. His financial difficulties had worsened without my periodic assistance. Linda's frustration with his inability to manage money independently had created tension in their marriage. He'd been forced to take a part-time job to supplement his Social Security income. None of this information came from him directly. He'd maintained complete silence since our grocery store encounter. But relatives continued assuming I knew about his problems and would eventually intervene to restore stability. "He's too proud to ask for help," my aunt explained during a phone call. "But I think he's hoping you'll reach out. He made it clear that I'm not his daughter in any way that matters," I reminded her. "I'm respecting his wishes by staying out of his life." That was just talk. He didn't mean it. He meant it enough to say it publicly at his wedding. I think we should take him at his word. These conversations with relatives became a pattern, well-meaning family members trying to facilitate reconciliation while misunderstanding the fundamental nature of what had broken between us. They saw our estrangement as a temporary conflict that could be resolved through compromise and forgiveness rather than recognizing it as the natural conclusion to a relationship that had never been sustainable. My career continued advancing in ways that felt increasingly natural rather than exceptional. The strategic training program led to assignment as a senior planning officer for complex international operations. My commanding officers valued my analytical approach and calm decision-making under pressure. For the first time in my adult life, I was experiencing consistent professional recognition without the background anxiety of managing my father's approval or disapproval. The mental energy I'd previously devoted to family crisis management was now available for career development and meaningful personal relationships. The transformation was profound enough that colleagues noticed the change. "You seem more focused lately," Colonel Martinez observed during a performance review. "More confident in your strategic recommendations." He was right, though I didn't fully explain the source of the change. Eliminating the constant effort to earn recognition from someone determined not to provide it had freed me to excel in environments where competence was valued straightforwardly. Jessica's updates from West Point became a bright spot in my routine correspondence. She excelled in her coursework and wrote detailed emails about strategic theory classes, leadership training, and her plans for military specialization. Her enthusiasm reminded me of my own early career excitement, but her foundation was stronger because she'd researched extensively before committing. "I think about our conversations all the time during strategic planning exercises," she wrote after completing her first semester. "The principles you explained about resource allocation and risk assessment have become second nature." Reading her emails, I realized I'd inadvertently gained something valuable from my father's rejection, the opportunity to mentor someone who genuinely appreciated and utilized what I offered. Jessica's success became proof that my knowledge and experience had worth beyond my own career advancement. By year's end, I'd established a life that operated entirely independently of my father's existence or opinion. The relationships I maintained were based on mutual respect and genuine interest. My professional achievements were recognized and valued by people who understood their significance. Most importantly, I'd stopped measuring my worth against the approval of someone who'd never been qualified to judge it accurately. Jessica's West Point graduation arrived 2 years after our first contact. She'd requested permission to list me as family for ticket allocation, and I'd agreed to attend the ceremony. Driving through the academy gates, I felt proud anticipation mixed with complex emotions about the family dynamics that had brought us together. The graduation was impressive, hundreds of newly commissioned officers preparing to serve their country with the kind of dedication I remembered from my own early career. Jessica looked confident and mature in her dress uniform, every inch the professional officer she'd worked so hard to become. After the ceremony, she introduced me to her classmates and instructors as Major Smith, my mentor who taught me strategic planning principles. No mention of our unusual family connection or the circumstances that had led to our relationship. Just straightforward acknowledgement of professional mentorship. Her mother and stepfather, my former father, attended as well. Linda looked uncomfortable seeing me there, while he seemed uncertain how to navigate the situation. We exchanged polite greetings and focused entirely on celebrating Jessica's achievement. During the reception, Jessica pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know how much your guidance has meant to me," she said. "I wouldn't be here without your example and encouragement. You would have succeeded regardless. You have the drive and intelligence that can't be taught. Maybe, but you showed me what was possible. You proved that military leadership could be both strategic and ethical, both effective and principled." Her words carried surprising emotional weight. For years, I'd wondered whether my military service had broader meaning beyond personal career advancement. Jessica's success suggested that my example had influenced someone else's path toward meaningful contribution. "I have something to tell you," she continued. "I'm planning to specialize in strategic operations, specifically the kind of international planning you've done. My instructors think I'm well prepared because of our discussions about real-world applications. That's exactly the right choice for your skill set. You'll excel in that field." "I hope so. And I hope we can continue our professional relationship as I advance through my career. I'd be honored to stay in touch and provide whatever guidance might be helpful." Later that evening, my father approached me while Jessica was taking photographs with her graduating class. We stood together watching her interact with fellow officers, both recognizing her remarkable transformation from the uncertain teenager we'd met at his wedding. "She talks about you all the time," he said quietly. "Your career, your achievements, your advice about military service. I had no idea you'd become so accomplished." "You never asked," I replied without malice, but with complete honesty. He was quiet for several moments, watching Jessica pose for group photos with obvious pride in her success. "I think I made a mistake," he said finally. "Several mistakes, actually." "Yes, you did. Is there any chance we could try again? Maybe start over somehow?" I studied his face, looking for genuine understanding rather than simply regret about consequences. "What would be different this time?" "I'd pay attention. I'd learn about your work, your life, your interests. I'd try to be the kind of father I should have been all along." "You had 28 years to try being that kind of father. What makes you think you'd be successful now?" The question was pointed but necessary. I'd learned not to accept promises from people who'd repeatedly demonstrated they couldn't or wouldn't change their fundamental approach to relationships. "I know I hurt you," he continued. "I know I didn't appreciate what you were offering. But seeing how much Jessica respects you, hearing about your accomplishments from someone who actually understands them, it's made me realize what I threw away." "You didn't throw it away. You never valued it in the first place. There's a difference." He looked stung by the assessment, but didn't argue. Around us, families celebrated their newly commissioned officers while we had the kind of honest conversation we'd never managed during my childhood. "I don't know how to fix what I broke," he admitted. "You can't fix it. Some things can't be repaired, only replaced. And I'm not interested in building a new relationship based on your current regret about the old one." "So that's it? It's over permanently?" "It's been over since your wedding speech. I'm just no longer pretending otherwise." We stood in silence for several more minutes, watching Jessica accept congratulations from various family friends and academy personnel. She radiated confidence and competence that reminded me of my own graduation years earlier, but she had advantages I'd lacked: clear career goals, strategic preparation, and genuine support from people who understood her chosen path. "For what it's worth," my father said as I prepared to leave, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I know I should have said that years ago. Thank you for saying it now. But my accomplishments don't require your validation anymore. The statement was true in ways that surprised even me. Somewhere during the past 2 years, I'd internalized the recognition I received from colleagues, superiors, and now Jessica. My worth was no longer measured against his approval or disapproval. Driving home from West Point, I reflected on the unexpected path that had led from public humiliation at his wedding to genuine mentorship with someone who'd become more family than many blood relatives. Jessica's success felt like validation not just of my professional expertise, but of the possibility that meaningful relationships could develop even from the wreckage of failed ones. 2 weeks later, she called from her first duty assignment. "I wanted to thank you again for attending graduation," she said. "It meant everything to have you there." "It was my honor." "How's the new assignment treating you?" "Challenging but exciting. I'm working with senior officers who knew about your Afghanistan operations. They speak about your strategic planning with real respect." "That's gratifying to hear." "Are you finding the work engaging?" "Absolutely. And I think about our conversations constantly. The principles you taught me about leadership under pressure are proving invaluable." Her enthusiasm reminded me why I'd chosen military service originally, the opportunity to contribute to something larger than personal advancement while developing expertise that could benefit others. Through Jessica, I was experiencing that contribution in ways I'd never anticipated. "I have a favor to ask," she continued. "My commanding officer suggested I apply for an advanced strategic planning program next year. Would you be willing to provide another reference letter?" "Of course. Send me the details, and I'll submit whatever documentation they require." "Thank you. I know it's a lot to ask since we're not actually related. We may not be related by blood, but we're connected by shared commitment to professional excellence and ethical service. That's a relationship worth maintaining regardless of family complications." After ending the call, I realized I'd found something unexpected in the aftermath of losing my father's recognition: the opportunity to provide genuine mentorship to someone who valued what I offered and used it constructively. Jessica's respect was earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited through family obligation. The relationship felt sustainable in ways that my connection with my father never had, because it was based on mutual appreciation and shared values rather than unequal emotional labor and conditional acceptance. For the first time in my adult life, I was experiencing family relationship that enhanced rather than drained my energy and self-respect. 3 years passed with minimal contact between my father and me, though Jessica kept me updated on family developments through our regular correspondence. He'd struggled with health issues related to diabetes and stress, requiring medication he could barely afford without insurance coverage. Linda had returned to work full-time to help manage their financial difficulties, creating tension in their marriage as reality confronted their early retirement plans. I felt neither satisfaction nor guilt about his struggles. They were simply the natural consequences of choices he'd made: financial mismanagement, relationship destruction, and failure to maintain the support systems he'd previously taken for granted. I'd learned to separate compassion for humans suffering from personal responsibility for problems I hadn't created. My own career had continued advancing in gratifying ways. The strategic planning position had led to assignment as Deputy Director for International Operations Coordination, a role that utilized both my analytical skills and my experience managing complex multi-agency relationships. The work was demanding but meaningful, contributing to humanitarian missions and peacekeeping operations worldwide. Colonel Martinez, now General Martinez, had become a genuine mentor whose guidance helped me navigate the political complexities of senior military leadership. "You've developed excellent judgment about resource allocation and personnel management," he told me during my latest performance review. "You're ready for more significant command responsibilities." The assessment led to my selection for a prestigious fellowship program that would prepare high-potential officers for senior strategic roles. The opportunity represented years of careful career development and consistent professional excellence. Jessica, meanwhile, had excelled in her first assignment and been selected for the advanced strategic planning program I'd recommended. Her commanding officers recognized her analytical capabilities and leadership potential, fast-tracking her towards specialized responsibilities typically reserved for more experienced officers. I'm being assigned to international development operations, she told me during one of our monthly calls. Coordinating with civilian agencies and foreign military partners to implement infrastructure projects in post-conflict regions. That's exactly the kind of assignment that will develop your strategic thinking and diplomatic skills. Congratulations on earning such valuable experience early in your career. I know I wouldn't have been prepared for this opportunity without our conversations about multi-agency coordination and cultural sensitivity in international operations. Her success felt personally meaningful in ways that surprised me. Through mentoring Jessica, I was discovering that my knowledge and experience had value beyond my own advancement. Teaching strategic principles to someone who implemented them effectively provided satisfaction that purely individual achievement couldn't match. I wanted to ask you something, Jessica continued. My commanding officer suggested I consider applying for graduate study in international relations while continuing military service. Do you think that would be valuable preparation for senior strategic roles? Absolutely. The combination of practical military experience and academic strategic theory will make you exceptionally well prepared for senior planning positions. Which programs are you considering? We discussed various graduate options and their alignment with her career goals. Her questions were sophisticated and well-researched, demonstrating the same systematic approach to professional development I'd learned to value in military planning. After ending our call, I realized Jessica had become the kind of family relationship I'd always hoped to have: mutual respect, genuine interest in each other's welfare, and support that enhanced rather than drained our individual goals. The irony that she was technically my former stepfather's stepdaughter wasn't lost on me, but it no longer seemed relevant to the connection we'd built. 2 months later, I received an unexpected phone call from Linda. Her voice carried stress and exhaustion I hadn't heard during our previous limited interactions. "I'm calling about your father," she said without preliminary pleasantries. "He's in the hospital with complications from his diabetes. The doctors say it's serious." "I'm sorry to hear that. How serious?" "They're not sure yet. He's been neglecting his medication because we couldn't afford regular doctor visits. Now his kidneys are showing signs of damage." I waited for her to continue, uncertain what response she expected from me. We'd had no contact for 3 years, and their marriage had been built partly on excluding me from family considerations. "I know you two haven't spoken," she continued, "but I thought you should know. In case you wanted to visit or anything. I appreciate you letting me know." "Is Jessica aware of the situation?" "Yes, she's flying home this weekend. She suggested I call you." That detail mattered. Jessica understood both family dynamics and my father's medical condition well enough to recommend contact despite knowing about our estrangement. Her judgment had proven reliable on professional matters. Perhaps it was equally sound regarding personal relationships. "Which hospital?" I asked. Linda provided details and visiting hour information, then hesitated before continuing. "He's been talking about you more lately. Especially when Jessica visits and mentions your career progress. I think he regrets how things ended between you." "Regret about consequences isn't the same as understanding what caused them," I said. "But I'll consider visiting." After ending the call, I found myself weighing obligations and opportunities with the same analytical approach I used for strategic planning. What were my actual responsibilities toward someone who'd explicitly rejected family connection? What outcomes were realistically possible from hospital visits during health crises? I decided to visit once, primarily to satisfy my own sense of completeness rather than from expectation that meaningful reconciliation was possible. Some situations required clear closure rather than ambiguous suspension. The hospital visit was awkward but not emotionally devastating. My father looked older and frailer than during our grocery store encounter years earlier. Diabetes and financial stress had aged him in ways that went beyond simple time passage. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said when I entered his room. I wasn't sure either. Jessica thought it might be important. We talked carefully for 30 minutes about neutral topics: his treatment plan, my work assignments, Jessica's recent achievements. Neither of us attempted to address our fundamental relationship issues or rehash past grievances. "I'm glad you're doing well professionally," he said as I prepared to leave. "Jessica tells me you're being considered for significant promotions." The military has been good to me. It's an environment where competence is valued consistently. He caught the implicit contrast, but didn't respond defensively. I hope you continue advancing. You've earned whatever recognition you receive. Thank you for saying that. I mean it. I should have said it years ago. The acknowledgement was genuine, but insufficient to rebuild relationship foundations that had never been solid. We'd both changed too much, and in incompatible directions, for simple apologies to bridge the accumulated damage. I visited twice more during his week-long hospitalization, maintaining the same careful politeness we'd established during the first encounter. Linda seemed grateful for my presence, though she didn't push for deeper reconciliation. Jessica coordinated her visit to overlap with mine, and together we helped manage discharge planning and follow-up care arrangements. The experience taught me that forgiveness and relationship restoration weren't synonymous. I could feel compassion for his health struggles and regret about our failed connection without wanting to rebuild what we'd never successfully constructed originally. Most importantly, I discovered that closure didn't require dramatic confrontations or emotional catharsis. Sometimes it simply meant acknowledging reality honestly and accepting what couldn't be changed. When I left the hospital after his discharge, we both understood that this represented final rather than renewed contact. The visits had satisfied whatever family obligations remained, but they hadn't created foundation for ongoing relationship. That evening, Jessica called to thank me for visiting and helping with discharge arrangements. "I know it wasn't easy for you," she said. "But I think it meant something to him that you came. It felt like the right thing to do. Not because I expected anything from it, but because some situations require clean endings." "I understand. And I want you to know that whatever happens between you and him doesn't affect our relationship. You've been the most important mentor in my life." Her words provided the reassurance I hadn't realized I needed. My connection with Jessica existed independently of family complications and would continue regardless of how other relationships evolved or dissolved. For the first time since my father's wedding speech years earlier, I felt completely at peace with the family structure that had emerged from the wreckage of the original one. I'd lost the relationship I'd thought I wanted, but I'd gained something potentially more valuable, genuine connection based on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Sometimes the best families are the ones you choose rather than the ones you inherit. 5 years after my father's hospitalization, I was promoted to full colonel and appointed as Director of Strategic Operations for the Pacific Command. The position represented the culmination of 2 decades of careful career development and consistent professional excellence. My responsibilities included coordinating multinational military exercises, developing strategic partnerships with allied forces, and overseeing humanitarian assistance operations across the Pacific region. Jessica, now a major herself, had completed her graduate degree in international relations while maintaining exemplary military performance. She'd been selected for a prestigious assignment coordinating reconstruction efforts in regions affected by natural disasters and political instability. Her work combined strategic planning, diplomatic engagement, and resource management, exactly the skills we discussed during her academy preparation years earlier. "I'm using principles you taught me constantly," she told me during one of our regular professional consultations. "The frameworks for multi-agency coordination and cultural sensitivity have become fundamental to how I approach every assignment. You've exceeded my expectations for how quickly you'd advance and how effectively you'd apply strategic concepts. Your commanding officers consistently praise your analytical capabilities and leadership potential." "I have some news," she said, her voice carrying excited anticipation. "I've been selected for the War College Fellowship Program. They want me to develop expertise in post-conflict reconstruction and international development coordination." "That's outstanding." "The War College Fellowship will position you perfectly for senior strategic roles. You'll be working with the most accomplished military strategists in the country. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to serve as my professional reference for the program. I know it's a significant commitment since fellows are mentored throughout the entire 2-year program. I'd be honored to provide ongoing mentorship. Send me the program requirements, and I'll submit whatever documentation they need." Her success had become one of the most satisfying aspects of my career. Through mentoring Jessica, I discovered that knowledge transfer and leadership development provided meaning that purely individual advancement couldn't match. Watching her implement strategic principles effectively while developing her own innovative approaches validated years of professional experience. My father's health had continued declining during the intervening years. Diabetes complications had required dialysis treatment he couldn't afford consistently. Linda worked multiple part-time jobs to manage their medical expenses, but their financial situation remained precarious. Extended family members occasionally updated me about his condition, though I maintained the boundaries established during his hospitalization. Jessica visited him regularly and shared general updates about his welfare during our conversations, though we both understood that reconciliation wasn't realistic. Too much damage had accumulated, and too much time had passed for simple medical sympathy to rebuild relationship foundations that had never been stable. He asks about your career sometimes, Jessica mentioned during one call. I tell him about your promotions and assignments, and he seems genuinely proud, but also regretful that he doesn't have direct connection to your success. Pride about outcomes isn't the same as investment in the process, I replied. He's welcome to feel proud, but that doesn't create obligation for renewed relationship. I understand. I just thought you should know that he's aware of what you've accomplished. The information was interesting, but not emotionally significant. Years of therapy and professional success had helped me understand that external validation couldn't repair internal damage caused by childhood rejection and adult dismissal. My worth was now measured by standards I controlled rather than approval from people who'd proven unable or unwilling to recognize my value consistently. My current assignment brought frequent travel and interaction with senior military leaders from allied nations. The work was complex and demanding, requiring analysis of political developments, strategic resource allocation, and coordination among military services that operated under different cultural assumptions and organizational structures. Colonel Smith's strategic assessments have become essential reading for Pacific Command leadership, General Martinez wrote in my latest performance evaluation. Her ability to synthesize complex political and military information into actionable strategic recommendations distinguishes her as one of our most valuable senior officers. The recognition felt earned through years of competent performance rather than granted through personal connections or family influence. Military advancement operated on merit-based principles that rewarded demonstrated capability and consistent excellence, everything my relationship with my father had lacked. During a planning conference in Hawaii, I encountered a senior Navy officer who'd served with my father decades earlier during his brief military enlistment. The officer recognized my name and asked about family connections. Haven't spoken with him in several years, I said honestly. We went different directions. That's too bad. He used to talk about you all the time during deployment. Carried pictures of you in his wallet, showed them to anyone who'd listen. Seemed really proud of having a daughter following military tradition. The information surprised me. I'd never known about my father's military service pride or his habit of sharing photographs with fellow service members. Perhaps his dismissal of my career had been more recent development than I'd understood, influenced by Linda's preferences rather than his original feelings. But the revelation didn't change fundamental realities about our failed relationship. Whatever pride he'd felt privately hadn't translated into consistent support or genuine interest during the years when such recognition would have mattered to my development. People change, I told the Navy officer. Sometimes they grow apart despite starting from similar places. 3 months later, Jessica called with news that my father had died suddenly from kidney failure. He'd been scheduled for emergency surgery but hadn't survived the procedure. Linda was managing funeral arrangements with assistance from Jessica and Michael, who'd returned from college for the services. I wanted you to hear it from me rather than through other family members, Jessica said gently. I know your relationship was complicated, but I thought you should have the option to decide about attending services. Thank you for calling directly. When is the funeral? Saturday afternoon. Linda said you're welcome to attend if you want to, but she understands if you prefer not to. I spent the rest of the week considering whether attendance would provide useful closure or simply reopen emotional complications I'd successfully resolved. Military training had taught me to analyze decisions based on realistic assessment of costs and benefits rather than abstract obligations or social expectations. Ultimately, I decided to attend the service, but not the reception afterward. I wanted to pay respects to someone who'd been important during my childhood, even if our adult relationship had failed irreconcilably. The funeral would provide closure without requiring extended social interaction with family members who might expect emotional reconciliation I wasn't prepared to offer. The service was simple and well attended by people from various phases of his life: work colleagues, community center volunteers, extended family members, and neighbors who'd known him as Linda's husband rather than my father. Jessica and Michael delivered thoughtful eulogies about his kindness and generosity, focusing on positive aspects of his character while acknowledging his human imperfections. I sat in the back of the chapel, maintaining respectful attention without drawing notice to my presence. Several relatives approached afterward to express appreciation that I'd attended despite our estrangement. Their comments were kind but brief, recognizing that this wasn't an occasion for extensive family reconnection. Linda thanked me quietly for coming and mentioned that he'd kept newspaper clippings about my military promotions in his desk drawer. "I think he was proud of you even when he couldn't figure out how to show it properly," she said. The information was bittersweet but not transformative. Private pride that never became public support had limited value for relationship building, though it suggested he'd maintained more awareness of my achievements than I'd realized. Walking away from the funeral service, I felt the kind of peaceful closure that comes from completing obligations without expecting emotional rewards. I'd paid appropriate respects to someone who'd shaped my early life, acknowledged the complexity of human relationships, and maintained the boundaries that protected my well-being. Most importantly, I'd confirmed that my worth didn't depend on his approval or disapproval, even posthumously. The life I'd built operated independently of his recognition, and that independence had become one of my most valuable achievements. That evening, Jessica called to check on my emotional state after the funeral. "How are you processing everything?" she asked with genuine concern. "I'm at peace with how things ended," I said honestly. "We both did the best we could with the emotional resources we had available. The outcome wasn't what either of us originally wanted, but it was probably inevitable given our incompatible approaches to relationship. I'm glad you can see it that way. And I want you to know again how much your mentorship has meant to my career development. You've been the most important professional influence in my life." Her words reminded me that meaningful relationships had emerged from the disappointment of failed ones. Through mentoring Jessica, I discovered the satisfaction of genuine connection based on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Sometimes the most important families are the ones you choose rather than inherit, and the most valuable legacies are the ones you create rather than receive. The story my father had intended to tell at his wedding, about mistakes and fresh starts and perfect children, had become something different entirely. It had become a story about resilience, professional achievement, and the possibility of finding genuine connection even after experiencing fundamental rejection. In the end, his assessment of me as a mistake had proven incorrect not because I'd changed his mind, but because I'd learned to measure my worth by more reliable standards. The military had taught me that competence earns respect, consistency builds trust, and integrity creates lasting value. Those lessons had served me well in building the life I actually wanted rather than continuing to pursue the approval I'd thought I needed. Years later, when junior officers ask for career advice, I tell them that success requires clear assessment of what's actually possible versus what we hope might eventually become available. Some relationships can be improved through patience and effort, but others need to be accepted as they are or gracefully released. The wisdom lies in recognizing the difference and investing energy accordingly. Jessica's career has continued flourishing in ways that validate everything I hoped mentorship could accomplish. She's now positioned for senior command responsibilities that will allow her to influence strategic policy at the highest levels of military planning. When she asks for guidance about complex professional decisions, I remember the 16-year-old girl who recognized my achievements when my own father couldn't be bothered to learn about them. Her respect was earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited through family obligation, and that foundation has proven strong enough to build meaningful relationships upon. Sometimes the best revenge against those who underestimate you is simply becoming everything they said you couldn't be, then sharing that success with people who genuinely appreciate what you've accomplished. I never needed to prove my worth to my father. I only needed to stop expecting him to recognize what was already there. And that's how I stopped being the mistake my father announced at his wedding and became the person who set the terms of my own life. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who refused to see your worth? Did setting boundaries bring you peace, or did it cost you more than you expected? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if you've ever had to reclaim your respect, hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around for more true stories about standing tall when others try to tear you down.